Welcome to a chilling tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Today we dive into a haunting story of love, betrayal, and a devastating quest for justice that spiraled into tragedy. Set in the rugged hills of 19th century America, this is a story that will make you question how far grief can push someone and how the search for truth can lead to unthinkable consequences. If you're fascinated by true crime stories that unravel the complexities of the human heart, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more gripping narratives. Let's step back in time and uncover a story that shocked a small town and left a legacy of sorrow. In 1880, Warren County, Tennessee was a region where pioneer families struggled to establish their roots amid the Cumberland Plateau. Dirt roads connected small, isolated communities where everyone knew each other, and secrets were hard to keep. It was a place where justice often depended more on a man's word than on the distant laws of Nashville. In this seemingly peaceful setting, a 22-year-old woman was about to discover that love can blind us to even the most obvious signs of danger. Emma Thompson believed she knew the man she planned to marry, but some truths only emerge when it's too late to change them. What happened in Warren County that winter of 1880 began as a story of forbidden love, but ended in a way that no one in the community would ever forget. Emma Thompson grew up in a wooden cabin 4 miles from downtown Warren County, where the smell of dried tobacco and the constant sound of axes cutting wood marked the rhythm of family life. Her parents, Samuel and Margaret Thompson, had arrived in Tennessee 18 years earlier, carrying only their tools and the determination to build a better life away from the industrial cities of the North. Samuel Thompson was known in the region not only as a dedicated worker, but also as a man who couldn't resist a good poker game. Every Saturday, when farm work allowed, he would head to O'Malley's saloon, where gaming tables operated until the early hours of the morning. It was a vice that Margaret tolerated with resignation, knowing that her husband never bet more than they could afford to lose. It was during these poker nights that Samuel met Caleb Reed, a 30-year-old man who had arrived in the county the previous spring. Caleb was different from the other local players. His clothes were of better quality, his manners more refined, and he seemed to have an inexhaustible source of money for betting. He claimed to have come from Chattanooga, where he had worked at a bank, before deciding to try his luck in the countryside. The first time Emma saw Caleb was on an October afternoon when he accompanied Samuel to the farm to pick up some sacks of corn that had been bet and lost the night before. She was in the yard hanging clothes on the line when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Looking up, she met the gaze of a tall man with dark hair and blue eyes that seemed to study her with disturbing intensity. Caleb Reed had a presence that filled any environment. His movements were calculated. His voice had a deep tone that commanded attention. And there was something in his smile that suggested knowledge that others didn't possess. When he spoke, he chose each word carefully, as if he were always playing a mental poker game with his interlocutors. During the following weeks, Caleb began appearing at the farm more frequently. He always had a plausible excuse. He wanted to buy fresh eggs, needed information about local roads, or simply came to talk with Samuel about upcoming poker games. But Emma noticed that his eyes always sought her out, and that he prolonged his visits when she was around. The conversations between them began innocently. Caleb asked about life in the county, about local families, about regional customs. Emma, who rarely had the opportunity to talk with someone from outside Warren County, was fascinated by the stories he told about Chattanooga and other cities he had visited. He described places where streets were paved, where there were theaters and libraries, where women wore imported silk dresses. Gradually, these conversations became more personal. Caleb spoke about his dreams of establishing his own business, perhaps a store or a small transportation company. Emma shared her frustrations with the isolated farm life, her desire to see the world beyond the Tennessee hills. There was a connection between them that transcended differences in origin and experience. Samuel Thompson, however, watched this approach with growing discomfort. During one of the poker games, he had heard rumors about Caleb that left him uneasy. Some players whispered that the young man had debts in Chattanooga, that he had left the city hastily for reasons no one knew completely. Others mentioned that he seemed to have too much money for someone who claimed to have lost his job at the bank. The tension exploded one November night, when Samuel found Emma and Caleb talking in the barn away from Margaret's eyes. The intimacy of the scene, They were sitting very close together, and Caleb was holding Emma's hand, enraged the father. He ordered Caleb to leave his property immediately and forbade Emma from speaking to him again. Samuel expressed his concerns about Caleb that night, calling him a ruthless vagrant who had appeared out of nowhere. He warned Emma about men who made a living deceiving others, insisting that Caleb had all the characteristics of an opportunist. Emma tried to argue, but Samuel was inflexible, claiming that his life experience gave him authority to recognize dangerous men. But young love rarely obeys paternal orders. Emma and Caleb began meeting in secret, always in places away from the farm. He would meet her on the road when she went to town for supplies, or wait for her near the church on Sundays. During these clandestine encounters, Caleb showed himself even more attentive, as if the prohibition had intensified his feelings. It was during one of these secret meetings that Caleb revealed his plans to leave Warren County soon, but confessed that he couldn't leave without her. He said he had saved enough money to start a new life elsewhere, away from the prejudices and limitations of rural county. He expressed his love for her and his desire for her to become his wife, arguing that he couldn't build a future where her father would always be between them. The escape proposal created an agonizing dilemma for Emma. She loved her parents despite the limitations they represented, but she also felt that her life was destined for something greater than taking care of chickens and planting corn until the end of her days. Caleb represented adventure, romance, and the possibility of a richer and more meaningful existence. During the following weeks, Emma lived in a state of constant internal agitation. She watched her parents with a mixture of love and resentment, seeing them simultaneously as obstacles to her happiness and as the only people who truly cared about her well-being. Samuel continued his warnings about Caleb, but his words only strengthened his daughter's determination to follow her own path. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a sense of urgency. Caleb pressured Emma to make a decision, claiming that the roads would soon become impassable and they would lose the opportunity to leave. He had found a house to rent in Knoxville, he said, and had contacts who could help him establish a business in the city. Margaret Thompson, who had observed her daughter's growing sadness, tried a gentler approach than her husband's. During an afternoon, while they prepared preserves for winter, she suggested that there were aspects about men that a young woman couldn't know just by observing them. She asked Emma to consider that perhaps her father, with all his life experience, might be right about Caleb Reed. But Margaret's words came too late. Emma had already made her decision. She planned to meet Caleb the next morning and leave with him, leaving only a letter explaining her reasons. She would spend her last night at the farm watching her parents, memorizing their faces, preparing for a farewell she believed would be temporary. Fate, however, had other plans. That same night, Samuel announced that he and Margaret would need to travel to Cookeville the next morning to resolve issues related to their land deed. It was a trip they had been postponing for months, but which could no longer be delayed. Emma saw in her parents' absence a perfect opportunity to leave without painful confrontations. She could leave the letter and be far away before they returned. But while helping her mother prepare provisions for the trip, a strange sensation invaded her, as if she was seeing Margaret for the last time. The night passed slowly, with Emma alternating between excitement about the planned escape and an inexplicable melancholy. She watched her parents preparing for the trip, noticing small details she had never perceived before. The way her father obsessively checked important documents, how her mother carefully stored her few jewels in a small leather bag. Samuel was particularly nervous that night, repeatedly checking the amount of money he would take to Cookeville. He had won a considerable sum in the previous week's poker games, almost $350 in gold and silver coins, and was worried about the safety of carrying so much money during the trip. Margaret suggested postponing the trip or asking someone for company, noticing her husband's anxiety, but Samuel insisted they couldn't delay any longer as the papers needed to be signed that week, or they would lose the opportunity to regularize the property. He touched the pocket where he kept the money, commenting that sometimes a man needs to take risks to protect what he has built. Emma listened to this conversation from the kitchen where she pretended to be washing dishes. The mention of money made her think of Caleb and how they would use their own savings to start a new life. She had no idea that these would be the last words she would hear from her father. The morning of December 10, 1880, dawned with a dense fog that covered the hills like a gray shroud. Samuel and Margaret Thompson left before sunrise, their wagon loaded with important documents and the considerable amount of money Samuel had won at poker. Emma watched them leave from her bedroom window, not knowing it would be the last time she would see them alive. The road to Cookville wound through narrow gorges and dense forests, a route of approximately 30 miles that normally took a full day to complete. It was a route known for its wild beauty, but also for its danger. Bandits occasionally attacked solitary travelers, especially those who appeared to be carrying valuables. Emma spent the morning in a state of growing nervousness, torn between anxiety about the planned departure with Caleb and an inexplicable uneasiness about her parents' trip. She had prepared a small suitcase with her most important clothes and written a letter explaining her decision, but something prevented her from taking the final step. Around noon, when she should have been meeting Caleb on the road, Emma was still at the farm, unable to leave. She told herself she was waiting to be sure her parents had arrived safely in Cookville, but deep down, she knew her hesitation had deeper roots. It was Caleb who came looking for her, appearing at the farm with an expression of urgency she had never seen before. He was pale, his clothes dirty with mud, and there was an agitation in his movements that contrasted with his usual calm. He said he needed to talk to her about something terrible that had happened. The words that followed transformed Emma's world into a nightmare. Caleb told her he had found her parents' wagon overturned on the road approximately 15 miles from the farm. Samuel and Margaret were dead, and it appeared they had been attacked by bandits. He had run to town to alert Sheriff Thomas Grayson, who was already on his way to the scene with some men. Caleb's description of the scene was simple, but disturbing. He said Samuel appeared to have been struck in the head, and that Margaret had tried to flee before being caught by the attackers. The wagon had been overturned with documents scattered on the ground, and all valuable objects had disappeared. Emma collapsed upon hearing the details, her mind unable to process the magnitude of the tragedy. Caleb held her while she cried, whispering words of comfort and promising he would take care of her. He explained that he had arrived at the scene by chance as he was traveling to Cookville on business, and that fate had placed him there to find the bodies. When Sheriff Grayson arrived at the farm a few hours later, his somber expression confirmed Caleb's version. Grayson was an experienced man who had served as a soldier during the Civil War, but even he seemed shaken by the brutality of the crime. He explained that the killers had taken not only the money, but also any valuable object, including Margaret's jewelry and Samuel's watch. The initial investigation revealed few useful clues. The footprints around the wagon were confused due to rain that had fallen during the night, and there were no witnesses in the isolated area where the crime occurred. Grayson suspected that the killers knew the Thompson family's habits and knew they would be carrying money. During the days that followed, Emma lived in a state of profound shock. Caleb remained constantly by her side, taking care of funeral arrangements and dealing with practical matters she couldn't face. He proved incredibly helpful, as if he had previous experience with similar situations. Samuel and Margaret Thompson's funeral was held 3 days after their deaths in a simple ceremony at the local church. The entire community attended, offering condolences and support to the young orphan. Caleb was always present, but discreetly in the background, respecting Emma's mourning while remaining available for any need. It was during this period that Emma began to notice strange details in Caleb's behavior. He seemed to know things about the crime scene that hadn't been mentioned publicly. During a conversation with some neighbors, he commented on the specific position in which the bodies were found, details that seemed too precise for someone who had simply stumbled upon the scene. There was also the question of his presence on the road at that specific moment. Caleb claimed to be traveling to Cookville on business, but when Emma asked about the nature of this business, he was vague, mentioning only investment opportunities that never materialized. In the days following the funeral, Caleb intensified his presence in Emma's life. He visited her daily, bringing food and offering help with farm tasks. His attentions were constant, as if he were trying to fill the void left by her parents' death. During one of these visits, approximately a week after the funeral, Caleb made a proposal that surprised Emma. He said he couldn't bear to see her suffering alone and wanted to marry her as soon as possible. He argued that she needed protection and stability, and that he could offer both. The proposal came with a ring, an elaborate piece with a small sapphire that shone with a hypnotizing blue light. Caleb explained that he had won the ring in a recent poker game and wanted to give Emma something beautiful to symbolize their commitment amid tragedy. Emma accepted the proposal, not so much out of love as out of a desperate need for stability and protection. Her parents' death had left a void in her life that seemed impossible to fill, and Caleb offered an anchor amid the emotional chaos she was experiencing. As was appropriate for the time, they decided that Emma would temporarily move to the house of Eleanor Wilson, a respected widow in the community, while they planned the wedding that would take place the following spring. Caleb would continue living in his quarters in town, visiting Emma daily under proper supervision. During this engagement period, Emma began to observe aspects of Caleb's behavior that had previously gone unnoticed. He demonstrated familiarity with the Thompsons' belongings, knowing where Samuel kept his tools and what the house's secret hiding places were. There were also subtle changes in his personality. The attentive Caleb she had known was gradually being replaced by someone more controlling. He questioned her movements when she went out to visit neighbors, insisted on accompanying her to town, and showed growing irritation when she mentioned her parents or expressed longing for her previous life. During the long nights at Eleanor's house, Emma found herself rethinking the events that had led to her parents' death. She began to question the coincidence of Caleb being on the exact road at the exact moment when her parents were attacked. The chances seemed too small to be just luck or bad luck. Eleanor Wilson, an observant woman who had lived in the county for decades, occasionally made comments that planted seeds of doubt in Emma's mind. She mentioned how strange it was that some people always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, or in the wrong place depending on how you looked at things. When Emma asked what she meant, Eleanor shook her head, saying they were just observations from an old woman who had seen a lot in life. These words echoed in Emma's mind during the following weeks, mixing with her own observations about Caleb's strange behavior. She began to wonder if there was something everyone was missing, some hidden truth behind the tragedy that had destroyed her family. The winter of 1881 arrived with brutal intensity, covering Warren County with thick layers of snow that further isolated the county's small communities. Emma continued living with Eleanor Wilson while planning her wedding to Caleb Reed, scheduled for spring. But the weeks of close coexistence with her fiancé had revealed aspects of his personality that left her increasingly uneasy. It was during a particularly cold February morning that Emma made the first discovery that would plant the seed of suspicion in her mind. She was at the farm helping Caleb check the animals when she noticed he was wearing a ring she had never seen before. It was a simple gold piece with a small sapphire, exactly like the ring her mother always wore. When Emma asked about the ring, Caleb seemed momentarily nervous before explaining that he had won it in a poker game the previous week. He said a traveling merchant had bet the ring and lost, and that Caleb had thought of keeping it as a wedding gift for her. But something about the ring made Emma's heart race. There was a small mark on the band, a scratch that her mother had accidentally made years before. Emma knew that mark intimately, as she had watched her mother polish the ring hundreds of times, always being careful not to aggravate the small defect. Emma asked to see the ring more closely, trying to keep her voice calm. Caleb hesitated for a moment before removing the ring and handing it to her. Emma examined the piece carefully, and there was no doubt it was her mother's ring, the same ring that had been stolen during the murder. She commented that it was a beautiful piece and asked again where he had won it. Caleb repeated his story about the traveling merchant, but his explanation sounded too rehearsed. He avoided eye contact while speaking, and his hands trembled slightly when he put the ring back on his finger. During the following days, Emma began to notice inconsistencies in his stories about the past, small contradictions she had previously ignored. He had said he worked at a bank in Chattanooga, but when she asked specific questions about banking work, his answers were vague and imprecise. The second discovery came 2 weeks later, when Emma was organizing Caleb's clothes that he had left at the farm. In the pocket of one of his coats, she found a silver pocket watch that she immediately recognized as belonging to her father. It was a distinctive piece with the initials ST engraved on the cover and a small dent that Samuel had made when he dropped it years before. This time, Emma didn't confront Caleb immediately. Instead, she put the watch back in the pocket and spent the following days watching his behavior, looking for other signs that could explain how he had acquired her parents' belongings. Paranoia began to set in, transforming every gesture of Caleb's into something potentially sinister. Emma began to recall details from the morning when Caleb had found her parents' bodies, details that at the time had gone unnoticed amid the shock and pain. She remembered that he had arrived at the farm with clothes dirty with mud, but the road was relatively dry that day. He had also demonstrated detailed knowledge of the crime scene, describing aspects that seemed to go beyond what someone would observe in a casual and traumatic encounter. During a visit to church on Sunday, Emma heard a conversation between two elderly women that made her blood freeze. They whispered about having seen Caleb riding on the road that led to Cookville a few days before her parents' murder. One of them murmured that she had commented to her sister at the time that it was strange to see that young Reed in those parts. When she asked what he was doing, he said he was exploring the region to buy land. The other woman shook her head, commenting that in that rocky area there was nothing worth buying and that she had always found it suspicious. Emma pretended not to be listening, but every word was engraved in her mind like red-hot iron. If Caleb was in the area before the murder, it suggested something very different from a coincidence. She began to wonder if he had been observing her family's habits, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The third discovery was the most disturbing of all. While helping to wash clothes at Eleanor's house, Emma found a shirt of Caleb's that he had asked her to clean. The shirt was stained with what appeared to be dried blood, dark stains that had resisted obvious cleaning attempts. When she confronted Caleb about the shirt, he claimed he had injured himself during a hunt and had forgotten to wash the piece properly. But Emma knew that Caleb hadn't gone hunting recently, and the bloodstains were too extensive to be explained by a minor injury. That night, while Caleb slept in his quarters in town, Emma mentally examined his hands and arms, remembering that she hadn't seen scars or marks that could corroborate his story about a hunting injury. Emma's mind began to construct a terrible narrative. Caleb had been in the area before the murder, possessed stolen belongings from her parents, and had clothes stained with blood that he couldn't adequately explain. The conclusion seemed obvious, but it was so horrible that she struggled to accept it. During the following weeks, Emma lived in a state of growing terror. She watched Caleb constantly looking for signs of guilt or confession, but he continued to act normally as if nothing had changed. He was attentive and caring, enthusiastically planned the wedding, and talked about the future they would build together. But Emma now saw sinister in every gesture. When Caleb kissed her, she wondered if those were the same lips that had smiled while killing her parents. When he held her hands, she imagined these same hands wielding the weapons that had taken Samuel and Margaret's lives. Caleb's behavior also began to change in subtle ways. He had become more possessive, questioning her movements and insisting on accompanying her whenever she left Eleanor's house. When she mentioned her parents or expressed longing, he quickly changed the subject or showed irritation. One afternoon, Emma decided to test her suspicions. She casually mentioned that she had found some old documents from her father and asked if Caleb would like to see them. His reaction was immediate and revealing. He became visibly nervous and asked what kind of documents they were. Emma replied that they were just old papers about the farm, nothing important. But Caleb's anxiety didn't diminish. He insisted on seeing the documents, claiming he wanted to help organize the family's affairs. His insistence seemed disproportionate for something he had described as unimportant. Emma's paranoia reached a critical point when she began to suspect that Caleb might be planning to kill her too. Perhaps he had killed her parents to get to her and the family property. Or perhaps she was simply an inconvenient witness who needed to be eliminated. She began to avoid being alone with him in isolated places, and always made sure Eleanor knew where she was when she left the house. The tension between them became palpable, although Caleb seemed not to notice or chose to ignore the changes in Emma's behavior. During the long winter nights, Emma lay awake planning what to do with her suspicions. She considered going to Sheriff Grayson, but knew her evidence was circumstantial. A ring and a watch that Caleb claimed to have won at poker, a shirt stained with blood that he explained as a hunting accident, and his presence in the area before the crime. All of this could have innocent explanations. More importantly, Emma knew that if her suspicions were correct and Caleb discovered that she knew the truth, he wouldn't hesitate to kill her too. Her only advantage was that he still believed she was an innocent and loving victim, incapable of suspecting his true nature. The decision forming in Emma's mind was terrible, but seemed inevitable. If she was right about Caleb, he was a killer who had murdered her parents and would probably kill her too when convenient. The legal system of the time was slow and often ineffective, especially against manipulative men like Caleb. Emma began to consider the possibility that the only justice her parents would receive would be that which she herself executed. The idea was terrifying, but also strangely liberating. She would no longer be a passive victim. She would take control of her destiny and ensure that her parents' killer paid for his crimes. The spring of 1881 brought with it a thaw that transformed Warren County's roads into rivers of mud, but also offered Emma the opportunity to discover more about Caleb Reed through casual conversations in the community. With more passable roads, she could make small trips to town under the pretext of buying wedding supplies while secretly paying attention to any comment that could confirm her growing suspicions. Emma had become a consummate actress, hiding her distrust behind forced smiles and conversations about wedding dresses. Caleb, apparently satisfied with her apparent submission, had relaxed his vigilance, allowing her to make occasional trips without his constant company. During a visit to church, Emma learned through casual comments that Caleb had asked many questions about her father during poker games. The men mentioned at home that he seemed excessively interested in Samuel's travel habits, asking about when he usually traveled and if he carried money. At the time, their wives thought he was interested in doing business, but now the questions seemed to have a more sinister purpose. This information would have been extremely useful for someone planning a robbery. Emma realized that Caleb had used poker games not just to play, but to collect information about prosperous families in the region. On another occasion, while buying supplies at the general store, Emma heard the owner, Henry Carter, talking with another customer about recent sales. He mentioned that Caleb had bought some unusual items in the weeks before the crime: ropes and a new knife. Carter commented that he had found it strange at the time, as Caleb seemed very nervous during the purchase, continually looking over his shoulder. Emma pretended to be interested in other products, but every word was engraved in her memory. Why would Caleb need ropes and a new knife, and why would he be nervous buying them? The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together disturbingly. During a casual conversation with Eleanor after dinner, the elderly widow mentioned something that made Emma's blood freeze. She had seen Caleb riding on rural roads several times in the weeks before the murder, always alone and always seeming to carefully observe traffic patterns. Eleanor explained that he claimed to be exploring the region to buy land, but it always seemed strange to her that a man interested in land would be focused on isolated roads instead of fertile fields. Each new piece of information that Emma collected through these casual conversations strengthened her conviction that Caleb had carefully planned her parents' murder. She interpreted his casual questions as if he were collecting strategic information and his presence on the roads as terrain reconnaissance. He hadn't found the bodies by chance. In her mind, he had positioned himself as the innocent discoverer to deflect suspicion. During a visit to the saloon to pick up Caleb, who was playing poker, Emma heard a conversation between some players that left her even more alarmed. They talked about valuable objects that had recently appeared in games, jewelry, and watches that seemed too refined for the rural region. One of the players commented on a ring that Caleb had bet the previous week, mentioning that it looked like a family heirloom, too beautiful to be just any object. Emma realized they were talking about her mother's ring. Caleb not only possessed the stolen objects, he was using them in poker games, treating them as if they were rightfully his. The most disturbing discovery came through a conversation with a traveling merchant who had passed through the region a few weeks earlier. The man mentioned that Caleb had tried to sell him some jewelry, claiming he had won it in a poker game. The merchant reported that Caleb possessed a gold ring with a sapphire and a silver watch, but something about the way he spoke had aroused suspicion. The pieces seemed too personal, too sentimentally valuable to be casually bet. The merchant had refused to buy the pieces, claiming he didn't have enough money, but the description matched exactly her parents' belongings. This confirmed that Caleb had tried to get rid of the stolen objects, keeping only some for personal use. During these weeks of discreet observation, Emma also noticed that Caleb seemed to have more money than before, buying new clothes and paying his bets with a generosity he hadn't shown previously. When she asked about his recent good luck, Caleb claimed to have had a winning streak at poker, but Emma knew that local games rarely involved significant amounts. The answer came through a casual conversation with Sheriff Grayson, who mentioned that the money stolen from her parents had never been recovered. It was mainly gold and silver coins, exactly the type of money Caleb was spending so freely. Emma also discovered through town gossip that there were rumors about similar crimes in neighboring counties. During a conversation with a woman who had come from McMinnville to visit relatives, she learned of at least 2 other cases of families attacked and killed on isolated roads. The woman explained that there was a pattern to these crimes: always prosperous families, always on isolated roads, always with excessive violence, as if someone were hunting specific people. Emma began to believe that Caleb could be responsible for more deaths than just her parents. In her paranoid mind, he had become a killer who had made a career of attacking rural families, using charm and manipulation to get close to his victims before attacking. With each new piece of information she collected through these casual conversations and observations, the image of Caleb as a calculating predator became clearer in Emma's mind. She interpreted his questions about the family as if he had studied her family like a hunter studies his prey, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, and the perfect moment to attack. Emma also began to believe that she herself had been part of the plan from the beginning. In her growing paranoia, she convinced herself that Caleb hadn't genuinely fallen in love with her. He had chosen her as a way to get close to her family. The romance had been an elaborate facade for a robbery and murder scheme. The most terrible revelation came when Emma understood that Caleb was probably planning to kill her too, once the marriage was consummated and he had legal access to the Thompson property. She would be just another victim in a long list of people who had trusted him and paid with their lives. The weight of evidence she had collected through casual conversations and observations was overwhelming in her mind. Caleb had lied about his past, had asked suspicious questions about her family, possessed stolen objects from her parents, and had tried to sell them to get rid of the evidence. Emma returned from her discoveries with absolute certainty of Caleb's guilt. She had gathered enough information to convince any rational person, but knew that Caleb was intelligent and manipulative. He could easily convince a court of his innocence. More importantly, Emma knew that if Caleb suspected she had discovered the truth, he wouldn't hesitate to kill her too. Her only advantage was that he still believed she was an innocent and loving victim. The decision Emma faced was terrible, but clear. She couldn't trust the legal system to deliver justice, and couldn't risk Caleb discovering her suspicions and killing her too. If she wanted justice for her parents' murders, she would have to take it into her own hands. The idea of killing Caleb was terrifying, but Emma had reached the conclusion that it was the only way to ensure he paid for his crimes and didn't make other victims. She began to meticulously plan how she would execute her revenge, observing Caleb's habits with the same attention she believed he had devoted to her family. The month of June 1881 arrived with deceptive beauty. Wildflowers covered the fields around the Thompson farm, and the air was perfumed with the sweet aroma of spring. But behind the serene facade, Emma was meticulously planning the murder of the man she believed had killed her parents. Every smile she offered Caleb was calculated. Every word of love was a carefully constructed lie to maintain his confidence while she prepared her revenge. Emma had spent weeks studying Caleb's habits, observing his sleep patterns, his daily routines, and identifying moments of vulnerability. She knew he slept deeply after his drinking nights, that he trusted her completely, and that he would never suspect that the woman he planned to marry was planning his death. The plan she developed was simple but effective. Caleb had the habit of having a glass of whiskey before sleeping when he visited the farm to check the animals, a routine he had maintained since they began planning the wedding. Emma decided she would use this habit against him. At Eleanor's house, she had found a small bottle of laudanum, a common medicine of the time used for pain and insomnia. Eleanor used it occasionally for her joint pains. Emma knew that in small doses it was harmless, but had heard that in larger quantities it could be dangerous, especially when mixed with alcohol. During the days leading up to the execution of her plan, Emma forced herself to act normally, discussing wedding plans and feigning enthusiasm for the future they supposedly would build together. Caleb, completely deceived by her performance, was more relaxed and confident than ever. On the night of June 20th, Emma put her plan into action. She had invited Caleb to dinner at the farm, saying she wanted to show him some improvements she had planned for the property. Since she still lived with Eleanor, This visit to the farm to execute her plan was carefully planned for when the widow was visiting her sister in another county. After dinner, she prepared Caleb's whiskey as she always did, but this time added a generous amount of laudanum to the drink. She didn't know exactly how much would be necessary, so she poured a dose she believed would be sufficient to cause the desired effect. The medicine was bitter, but the strong taste of whiskey masked any difference in flavor. Caleb drank the mixture without suspecting anything, commenting only that the whiskey seemed stronger than usual. They talked casually about wedding preparations while he finished the drink. The laudanum mixed with alcohol acted quickly. Caleb began to feel drowsy and disoriented, attributing his symptoms to fatigue from a long day of work. Emma helped him lie down on the living room sofa, feigning concern while observing the drug's effects intensify. In the following hours, Caleb's breathing became increasingly slow and labored. Emma remained by his side, holding his hand and whispering words he could no longer understand. When he tried to speak, his words were incoherent, his eyes glassy and confused. In a moment of lucidity, he managed to murmur a question about why she was doing this to him, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of confusion and betrayal. Emma leaned over him, her face a mask of cold determination. She replied that she knew what he had done to her parents, that she had found her mother's ring and her father's watch, and that she knew he had killed them. Even in his weakened state, Caleb tried to deny weakly, shaking his head and trying to form words of protest. But Emma interpreted his denial as another lie, another attempt at manipulation, even in the face of death. She whispered that he could die knowing that his last victim had become his executioner, watching as life slowly drained from his eyes. Caleb Reed died in the early hours of June 21, 1881. His last words being a weak and desperate denial of guilt that Emma rejected as final lies from a condemned killer. Emma spent the rest of the morning carefully preparing the scene. She hid the laudanum bottle, washed the whiskey glass meticulously, and rehearsed the story she would tell the authorities. When she returned to Eleanor's house at the end of the morning, she claimed to have found Caleb dead when she arrived at the farm to check the animals. Eleanor, who had returned from her trip the previous night, accompanied Emma back to the farm and helped call Sheriff Grayson. When the authorities arrived, they found a devastated young bride crying over her fiancé's body, who had died suddenly during the night. The local doctor, Dr. William Hayes, examined the body and concluded that Caleb had died of natural causes, possibly sudden heart failure aggravated by alcohol consumption. Autopsy was not common at the time, especially in cases that appeared to be natural death, and no one suspected poisoning. The smell of alcohol on the body masked any residual odor of laudanum. Emma perfectly played the role of the mourning bride. She organized a simple funeral, cried appropriately during the ceremony, and accepted the community's condolences with apparent grace. Inside, she felt a deep and dark satisfaction. Her parents' killer had paid for his crimes, as Caleb's fiancée, Emma, had access to his personal belongings to help organize them after his death. It was then that she recovered her mother's ring and her father's watch, keeping them as mementos of her successful revenge. She saw them as trophies of justice, proof that she had managed to do what the legal system had failed to do. During the months that followed, Emma lived alone at the farm, supporting herself with the savings she had inherited and occasional sales of agricultural products. She became a respected figure in the community, a young woman who had suffered double tragedies, but had found strength to continue. No one suspected that behind her serene facade was a woman who had executed her own version of justice. The truth began to emerge in the fall of 1881, 6 months after Caleb's death. Sheriff Grayson received a letter from a colleague in a neighboring county informing about the capture of a man named Amos Wheeler, who had confessed to a series of murders and robberies in the region during the previous 2 years. Wheeler was a middle-aged man addicted to gambling and alcohol who had developed a pattern of attacking rural families to support his vices. His confession included specific details about Samuel and Margaret Thompson's murder, details that only the real killer could know. Wheeler described how he had observed the Thompson farm for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity. He knew about the planned trip to Cookville and had prepared an ambush on the isolated road. After killing the couple, he had looted their belongings, selling most of the stolen objects to other players during poker games in different cities. What most shocked the authorities was the revelation that Wheeler had sold Margaret's ring and Samuel's watch during a poker game in Warren County just a few days after the murder. Caleb Reed had been one of the players that night and had won the objects legitimately without knowing their criminal origin. The subsequent investigation revealed that Caleb had really worked at a bank in Chattanooga, but had lost his job due to gambling problems. He had arrived in Warren County trying to restart his life and had genuinely fallen in love with Emma. His lies about the past were motivated by shame and the desire to impress her, not by criminal guilt. The objects that Emma had found in his possession were really items he had won in poker games, as he had claimed. His presence on the road on the day of the murder had been a terrible coincidence. He was really traveling to Cookeville to look for work when he discovered the bodies. His familiarity with the Thompson farm came from his frequent visits during courtship, and his questions about the family's habits were the result of casual conversations with Samuel during poker games. There was nothing sinister in his behavior, just a man trying to integrate into the family of the woman he loved. The purchases he had made, ropes and a knife, were for property repairs he planned to make after the wedding. His nervousness when buying them was the result of his tight financial situation, not criminal intentions. The extra money he had shown came from a genuine winning streak at poker, not from robberies. When the truth was revealed, Emma felt as if the world had collapsed around her. She had killed an innocent man, a man who genuinely loved her, and who had been as much a victim of circumstances as she herself. Her thirst for revenge had blinded her ability to judge, leading her to interpret coincidences as evidence and suspicions as facts. The guilt that followed was overwhelming. Emma realized she had become exactly what she most hated, a killer who had taken the life of an innocent. Worse still, she had destroyed her only chance of genuine happiness after the tragedy that had devastated her family. During the following weeks, Emma struggled with the weight of her guilt and the impossibility of undoing what she had done. She considered confessing her crime to the authorities, but knew this would only add more tragedy to an already devastating situation. Caleb was dead, and her confession wouldn't bring him back. Emma began to have nightmares where Caleb appeared to her, not with anger, but with sadness in his eyes. In the dreams, he asked why she hadn't trusted him, why she hadn't given him the chance to explain. She woke up in tears, knowing she had destroyed the only true love she had known. The irony of her situation was unbearable. She had spent months collecting evidence of his guilt, when in reality, she was building a case based on coincidences and misguided interpretations. Her paranoia had transformed an innocent man into a monster in her mind. Emma realized she had allowed herself to be consumed by pain and anger, allowing these feelings to cloud her judgment. She had wanted so badly to find someone to blame for her parents' death that she had created a villain where none existed. The farm, which had once been a home full of love and laughter, had now become a mausoleum of her terrible decisions. Every room reminded her of Caleb, the sofa where he had died, the table where they had planned their future together, the fields where he had dreamed of working beside her. Emma's final decision came on a cold night in January 1882. She could no longer live with the knowledge that she had killed Caleb based on unfounded suspicions and circumstantial evidence. The irony of her situation was unbearable. She had become a killer trying to avenge murders, perpetuating exactly the kind of violence that had destroyed her family. Emma spent her last night writing a detailed letter confessing to Caleb Reed's murder and explaining the events that had led to her fatal decision. She wanted the truth to be known, for Caleb to be cleared of any posthumous suspicion, and for her story to serve as a warning about the dangers of blind revenge. In the letter, she wrote that she had believed she was delivering justice, but had discovered too late that she had become the very thing she sought to destroy. Caleb was innocent, and she had killed him based on suspicions and coincidences she had interpreted as evidence. She couldn't live knowing she had destroyed the life of the man who loved her, and who could have been her salvation after losing her parents. The letter continued explaining that her death should serve as a warning about the dangers of blind revenge and hasty judgment. Pain can make us monsters, and the thirst for justice can lead us to commit the same atrocities we seek to punish. She was now paying the price for her arrogance and her inability to see the truth through the fog of her pain. On the morning of January 15, 1882, Eleanor Wilson found Emma Thompson's body hanging from a beam in the farm barn. Beside the body was the letter confessing everything along with her mother's ring and her father's watch. The objects she had recovered from Caleb and now knew he had obtained innocently. The tragedy of Emma Thompson leaves us with haunting questions about justice, truth, and the devastating power of unchecked emotions. Her story is a stark reminder that pain can distort our reality, turning allies into enemies and suspicions into deadly certainties. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with others who love diving into the complexities of true crime. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that uncovers the darker sides of human nature. What are your thoughts on Emma's tragic journey? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video for another gripping tale.